Meet Ryan and Steve. They are both 32. They live in the same city. They both earn $80,000 a year. And after years of responsible financial decisions, canceled subscriptions, and convincing themselves that supermarket brand cereal tastes exactly like the expensive stuff, they've both managed to save $80,000. Financially, they are identical. Personality-wise, not even close. Ryan likes stability in every part of his life. He likes having a plan and knowing what comes next. He wants a place that feels permanently his, a garage for tools he may or may not know how to use, a backyard he can slowly become irrationally protective of, and the freedom to make the place completely his own. Steve is different. He values flexibility. He likes keeping his options open and knowing he can change direction whenever he wants. He doesn't know where he'll be 5 years from now, and honestly, he prefers it that way. The idea of committing to the same address for the next 30 years makes him slightly more nervous than it probably should. Eventually, those two very different personalities lead them to two very different financial decisions. Ryan buys a home, Steve keeps renting, and for the next 20 years, we're going to follow them both. Every mortgage payment, every rent increase, every repair bill, and every dollar Steve saves by renting and actually invests. Then, at the end, we'll see where two people who started with the exact same income, the exact same savings, but chose two completely different paths, actually ended up. Let's find out. Ryan and Steve are currently renting in the same mid-sized American city. After months of searching, dozens of property listings, and more house viewings than Ryan would ever like to admit, he finally finds the one. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a small backyard, and a garage large enough to store exercise equipment he will never use. He decides to buy it. The home costs $350,000. Ryan puts $70,000 down, exactly 20%. That leaves him with a $280,000 mortgage. But the down payment isn't the only money Ryan needs to buy the house. There are closing costs, lender fees, title fees, inspections, prepaid taxes, and approximately 46 documents he's asked to sign while understanding almost none of them. Closing costs can vary significantly depending on the situation. Let's assume Ryan pays $10,000 in closing costs. So before he has even moved in, Ryan has already used his entire $80,000, $70,000 for the down payment, and another $10,000 for closing costs. He takes out a 30-year fixed mortgage at 7%. That gives him a monthly principal and interest payment of about $1,863. But that's just the mortgage. Owning the house comes with a few other expenses. Let's assume $350 a month for property taxes, $150 for homeowners insurance, and $290 a month set aside for maintenance. That's about 1% of the home's original value per year. So Ryan's initial monthly housing cost is approximately $1,863 for the mortgage, plus $350 for property taxes, plus $150 for insurance, plus $290 for maintenance. That's about $2,653 a month. Meanwhile, Steve's calculation looks very different. He rents a comparable 3-bedroom home nearby for $2,000 a month. No property taxes, no homeowner's insurance. And if the water heater suddenly decides to retire, that's his landlord's problem. That leaves Steve with an initial difference of about $653 every month. For a brief moment, that money starts looking suspiciously like a trip to Thailand. But Steve resists the temptation. Instead, he decides to invest every dollar he saves by renting. Steve puts the $80,000 he didn't use to buy a house into a broad stock market index fund. And from that point on, whenever renting is cheaper than Ryan's assumed housing cost, Steve invests the difference. For our calculation, we'll assume the investment earns an average 10% per year. At least initially, Steve's decision looks pretty good. He lives in a similar house, pays less each month, and has his money working for him in the market. The first 3 years. Now, this is usually where someone says, yeah, but Steve is throwing $2,000 away on rent. Ryan's mortgage payment is building equity. And technically that's true, but there's a small problem. Especially in the early years, Ryan's mortgage builds equity painfully slowly. In Ryan's very first month, his mortgage payment is about $1,863, but almost all of that payment isn't reducing the loan. At 7%, his first month's mortgage interest is about $1,633. So only about $230 of that first payment actually reduces his mortgage balance. And that's before property taxes, before insurance, before maintenance. Once we include those expenses, Ryan is spending about $2,653 a month on housing, while only roughly $230 of his first month's total payment is actually building home equity. The other roughly $2,423 is simply the cost of owning the house during that month. Meanwhile, Steve pays $2,000 in rent. Yes, that rent builds no equity, but calling rent, throwing money away, while pretending mortgage interest, property taxes, insurance, and roof repairs are investments is creative accounting. Now let's fast forward 3 years. Ryan has made 36 mortgage payments. He's built up some equity, and he's learned one of the first lessons of home ownership. When you own the house, every strange noise suddenly has financial consequences. One Saturday, the water heater stops working. Ryan watches a YouTube video titled, "Easy Water Heater Fix." Anyone can do this. 4 hours later, he calls someone who actually can. The repair costs him a few $100s. Fortunately, expenses like this are exactly why Ryan has been budgeting for maintenance. After 3 years of mortgage payments, Ryan's mortgage balance has fallen from $280,000 to approximately $270,835. So he has paid down about $9,165 of principal, but the house itself may also have changed in value. To keep our calculations simple, let's assume the home appreciates by an average of 3.5% per year. After 3 years, the $350,000 house would be worth approximately $388,000. Subtract Ryan's remaining mortgage of about $270,835. That gives Ryan approximately $117,000 in home equity. That's real wealth. But now let's look at Steve. Steve has paid $72,000 in rent over those 3 years, but his original $80,000 has remained invested. At an average 10% annual return, that original $80,000 has grown to roughly $106,000. And Steve has also been investing the monthly difference between his rent and Ryan's assumed housing cost. During those first 3 years, that difference starts at about $653 and gradually becomes a little smaller as rent increases. After accounting for those contributions and their investment growth, Steve's portfolio is worth roughly $131,000 after 3 years. So after 3 years, the result is surprisingly close. Ryan has built about $117,000 in home equity. Steve has built about $131,000 in financial investments. Ryan can paint the living room whatever color he wants. Steve can move next month. But there's something else happening. Ryan's mortgage is slowly disappearing. Every month, a little more of his payment goes toward principal. At the beginning, the interest was doing most of the work. Now, after a decade, more of each payment is finally going toward reducing what Ryan owes. And this is where time starts working in Ryan's favor. The principal and interest portion of his mortgage stays fixed. Steve's rent keeps climbing. But Steve still has that investment portfolio quietly compounding in the background. And that's the strange thing about this comparison. Both men are becoming wealthier. They're just building wealth in completely different places. Ryan is building wealth inside a house. Steve is building wealth inside a portfolio. One can be painted, the other can be sold with a few clicks. One has a roof, the other has thousands of companies, and both come with their own problems. Now let's jump to year 10. Ryan is 42. His home, appreciating at an assumed 3.5% per year, is now worth approximately $494,000. After 10 years of mortgage payments, his remaining loan balance is about $240,275. That leaves Ryan with roughly $253,000 in home equity. He now walks around the property with the confidence of a man who owns more than half of every brick. Over the decade, he has also spent money maintaining and repairing the house. Some of that improved the property. Some of it simply stopped the property from slowly returning to nature. Steve, meanwhile, has kept investing. At a 10% average annual return, his original $80,000 alone is now worth roughly $207,500. Notice something important here. The original $80,000 hasn't become $27,000. It has become more than $200,000. That's the power of compounding. And throughout those 10 years, Steve has also invested the money he saved each month by renting. That amount started at about $653 a month, but as his rent increased by 3% every year, that monthly advantage gradually became smaller. After accounting for those investments and their growth, Steve's portfolio is now worth roughly $290,000. So after 10 years, Steve is still ahead in liquid financial assets. But something important has changed. His rent is no longer $2,000. After 10 years of 3% annual increases, It's approximately $2,688 per month. Ryan's principal and interest payment is still about $1,863. Steve is now paying significantly more rent than he started with, and the difference between renting and owning has become much smaller. But Steve still has one cost that never disappears: rent. After 20 years of 3% annual increases, his original $2,000 rent has grown to approximately $3,612 per month. Ryan, meanwhile, is much closer to owning his house outright. His 30-year mortgage still has 10 years remaining, and if he keeps making his payments, eventually the mortgage disappears. Steve's rent doesn't have a finish line. That's a huge difference. But Steve's result comes with one very important condition. He actually had to invest the difference. Every month for decades. When the market rises, you invest. When it falls 30%, you invest. When financial news announces the end of capitalism for the fourth time that decade, you invest. The spreadsheet assumes discipline. Human beings often have other plans. The money he was supposed to invest becomes a nicer car, a few holidays, a slightly more expensive lifestyle. And 10 years later, the investment portfolio that looked fantastic in the spreadsheet somehow never made it out of the spreadsheet. A mortgage, on the other hand, creates a form of forced saving. Ryan doesn't decide every month whether he feels like building equity. The bank has already made that decision for him. And behaviorally, that matters. Now let's go to year 20. Ryan and Steve are 52. Ryan's home, appreciating at an assumed 3.5% per year, is now worth approximately $696,000. His mortgage balance has fallen to about $160,440. That leaves him with approximately $536,000 in home equity. Steve's portfolio has also been compounding for 20 years. His original $80,000 alone is now worth roughly $539,000 at a 10% annual return. And that doesn't include the additional money he invested during the years when renting was cheaper. Remember, once Steve's rent eventually catches up with Ryan's simplified housing cost, he stops having a positive monthly difference to invest. But the money he already invested keeps compounding. After 20 years, Steve's total portfolio is worth roughly $752,000 under our assumptions. So after 20 years, on this simplified investment versus home equity comparison, Steve has come out ahead. Approximately, Ryan, $536,000 in home equity. Steve, $752,000 in investments. That's a difference of roughly $216,000. But their wealth looks very different. Steve's is much easier to access. Ryan cannot sell 8% of the kitchen, at least not without creating some serious questions from future buyers. If Steve needs $20,000, he can sell part of his investment portfolio. Ryan needs $20,000, and he can't simply remove $20,000 worth of bricks from the garage. He may need to borrow against the property, refinance, or ultimately sell it. Home equity is wealth. But it isn't particularly easy to spend. But buying has weaknesses of its own. The first is time. If Ryan had sold after only 3 years, the closing costs going in, selling costs coming out, and interest-heavy early mortgage payments could easily have wiped out much of his advantage. Buying generally needs time for the numbers to work in your favor. The longer you stay, the more time you have for the mortgage balance to fall and the property to potentially appreciate. The second issue is mobility. Imagine that several years into their journey, both Ryan and Steve receive incredible job offers in another state. Steve's decision is relatively simple. He gives notice, packs, and leaves. Ryan can move too. But he has another decision to make. He can sell the house, which means dealing with selling costs and finding a buyer. Or he can rent the house out and move. But now he has a mortgage on one property, rent in another city, and a tenant who may or may not cover all his costs. Any shortfall comes directly out of Ryan's pocket, leaving him with less money to save and invest. Then there is concentration risk. Steve owns a diversified portfolio containing thousands of companies. Ryan owns one house, on one street, in one neighborhood, in one city. If the area performs brilliantly, Ryan benefits. If the local economy struggles, he can't rebalance his portfolio by selling the upstairs bathroom. And finally, liquidity. If Steve needs $20,000, he can sell part of his portfolio. Ryan needs $20,000, and things become more complicated. Home equity is valuable. But valuable doesn't always mean liquid. So, which is better? Buying or renting? The honest answer is, it depends. Buying becomes more attractive when you plan to stay for a long time. 7 to 10 years or more gives transaction costs more time to be absorbed. Principal paydown accumulates. A fixed mortgage payment can become more valuable as rents rise. And appreciation has more time to work. Buying also becomes more attractive when property prices are reasonable relative to rent. One rough tool for thinking about this is the price-to-rent ratio. Take the home price and divide it by the annual rent for a comparable property. In our example, the house costs $350,000. Comparable rent starts at $2,000 per month. That's $24,000 per year. So, $350,000 divided by $24,000 equals about 14.6. That's a relatively low price-to-rent ratio. As that ratio gets much higher, particularly above 20, renting can become more competitive. But it's only a shortcut. Mortgage rates matter. Property taxes matter. Insurance matters. Maintenance matters. Expected investment returns matter. And perhaps most importantly, your behavior matters. Renting becomes more attractive when home prices are high relative to rent, when flexibility has real value, and when the renter actually follows through on investing the difference. Because if you rent for 20 years but spend every dollar you save, the investment advantage disappears. And of course, it doesn't have to be either or. Buying a home doesn't mean you have to stop investing. You can own a house and still invest in the stock market. You can rent and still build wealth. Personal finance is rarely about finding one perfect strategy. It's about understanding the trade-offs. Ryan traded liquidity and mobility for stability, leverage, and long-term control over his housing. Steve traded housing certainty for flexibility, liquidity, and more money invested in financial markets. Neither choice was automatically smart. Neither was automatically stupid. The real decision comes down to two questions. How long are you actually going to stay? Because if you buy a house and leave 3 years later, transaction costs can punish you. And if you rent, will you genuinely invest the difference? Because if you rent for 20 years and spend every dollar you save, the investment advantage disappears. So no, rent isn't automatically throwing money away. Renters pay rent. Homeowners pay interest, taxes, insurance, maintenance, and transaction costs. Both are paying for housing. And homeownership can absolutely build enormous wealth. But it's also an expensive, illiquid asset with ongoing costs, concentration risk, and a roof that occasionally requests $12,000. The winner isn't always the homeowner. And it isn't always the renter. Ryan needed to stay long enough for buying to work. Steve needed to invest consistently enough for renting to work. Because 20 years later, the difference between them didn't simply come down to who bought and who rented. It came down to what they did after making that decision. And that's probably the most important part of this entire story. The house didn't magically make Ryan wealthy, and renting didn't magically make Steve wealthy. Their decisions only created different paths. Ryan had to keep paying his mortgage. Steve had to keep investing. Ryan had to accept less liquidity. Steve had to accept rising rent. Ryan took on concentration risk. Steve took on market risk. And both of them had to live with their decision for the next 20 years. Under our assumptions, Steve ends up with more financial assets. But Ryan ends up owning a home with a large amount of equity and a clear path toward eventually eliminating his mortgage. And if you change the assumptions, the winner can change. If the stock market returns less, Steve's advantage gets smaller. If the house appreciates faster, Ryan catches up. If rent rises faster, Steve's advantage shrinks. If Ryan stays for only 3 years, buying becomes much less attractive. If Steve stops investing, his entire strategy starts falling apart. The winner isn't always the homeowner, and it isn't always the renter. The real winner is the person who understands what they're giving up, what they're getting in return, and then makes the decision intentionally. And let me know in the comments. Are you buying, renting, or waiting for interest rates and house prices to both come down at the same time? In which case, I admire your optimism. See you in the next one.